This Advent, we have been focusing on prophets. And we get the prophet today who changed all of human history in the scene of the Annunciation. Mary of Nazareth, with a visitation by the angel Gabriel, we celebrate her prophetic courage and her dangerous memory. The prophet comes in many different ways, and we've seen in art and poetry and theater beautiful scenes of the Annunciation. And art directs us prophetically towards beauty. I would like to share about an artist that I believe is a prophet and paints the Annunciation. Henry Ossabaw Tanner was born in Pittsburgh in 1859. His father, Benjamin Tucker Tanner, was a bishop, an African Methodist of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. His mother, Sarah Elizabeth Miller, escaped slavery as a child. His parents gave him the middle name Ossabaw to honor the anti-slavery campaign launched 3 years earlier by John Brown in Osawatomie, Kansas. And as we know, right here in Harper's Ferry, John Brown started out a pacifist but saw violence as a way that he had to address it, at least for him. Racism. Henry Ossabaw Tanner takes his life experience of racism and paints the Annunciation from this experience of his mom being a runaway slave, of his dad who had versed him well in the scriptures, and as he grew in his ability in art, he would go to Paris and study, and a wealthy individual would send him to Palestine. And so all these images come together of light coming down. No angel, just light. And this is the Annunciation of Mary sitting, a black woman, enfolded in heavy drapes of bedclothes and her own robe. Her gaze is attentive to that light. What Mary's gaze is fixed on is this tall, thin pillar of white cloud at the end of the bed. Perhaps Tanner is remembering the presence of God, the angel of Exodus described as a cloud that leads the Israelites into the future, would lead Mary into hers, and will lead us through the ordinary, familiar events and places where God is present if we will only recognize Him and respond with our own, "Here I am, Lord, let it be done to me according to your word." You see, Henry takes this image like an old spiritual, or like the metaphors of the Exodus story of how slaves were being led to freedom from slavery. And he can see in his mom, in his life, in his current events, how this story is leading his people out of oppression, despite all the racism he and others faced. And the reality is that the racism that he experienced in this country when he went to Paris and married an American woman, he didn't experience that same racism there. This reminds us of who Mary was. Too often, images of Mary have been placated and sterilized in the Middle Ages as if she was a queen of heaven, which she wasn't. This courageous woman was on the bottom of the Roman society, under Roman occupation. The danger that she may have the Messiah could cause revolution just like John Brown and we've seen happen in this area near Nazareth. The fact that she was found with child and did not know who the father was could mean that she was stoned. And yet the courage that she would say, "Let it be done to me according to your word." You see, the reading from Samuel, God's dream for a fitting home for his son, was very different from that divine place that David proposed. After David has settled down, and this phrase is significant, in his house of cedar, David has the bright idea of also building a fine house in which God could dwell. David is surprised by God's response spoken through the prophet Nathan, who lets him know that settling down is not characteristic of Israel's God, who is not a God to be circumscribed and enthroned and sterilized like the gods of their pagan neighbors. The God of Israel is a free Exodus God who prefers to move among the people. David's God, Mary's God, Henry Ossawa Tanner's God is a God of surprises, who always takes the initiative and often turns upside down the tables of our expectations. This God points to the future. One of David's descendants will build a house for God's name and establish a kingdom that will be everlasting. This is not a building, but will begin in the womb of Mary, Nazareth, as the Spirit touches that and brings about a birth. We're not to settle down, but follow this unruly Word of God, our yes, as Pope Francis tells us. But imagine the extraordinary events that took place in Nazareth, far from the center of power of religion and political power in Jerusalem, that we can feel so helpless and insignificant. And yet this woman on the margins is where God is. And as we've seen again and again with the prophets, if we want to discover God, we have to go to the edge. We have to go to the margins. We have to wake up to the reality of human history and all of its political or religious abuse or whatever it is, that God is present in the events of human history. That's what the Annunciation is about. And that's what, thank God, Henry Ossawa Tanner reminds us of. And so have we seen it this Advent? Can we see God on the fringes? Can we see God in the edges? Like Mary, like black women who are courageous in our society, calling for racial justice and Black Lives Matter. Or a pandemic who's wiped out many, sadly, people. And yet, God present in that suffering and a need for a vaccine. At the border, children in cages, as Jesus was a refugee. In these events of human history, in the sexism, and we can see in our own church, and the abuse of women, and the call to be set free for equality. These are the dangerous memories of the Annunciation. This is where the unruly Word of God is present. And as Paul reminds us in Romans, that the secret mystery has been disclosed in this picture, in this image, in this reality of the Annunciation. It's present. And our challenge this last Sunday of Advent is what Augustine calls us to do. That we would be impregnated by that unruly Word of God. That God desires and is going to bring to birth if we say yes. And all of human history depends upon us, folks. Mary didn't have to say yes. And yet, how different the world would be if it wasn't for her yes. And so, we renew our baptism here in a moment, and we celebrate all the dangerous memories we've talked about this Advent. We celebrate Alfred Delp, who brought about the unruly Word of God in chains as he was executed by Hitler. We celebrate Teilhard de Chardin, who was on the trenches of World War I and saw a better future. We celebrate Henry Ossawa Tanner, Henry Ossawa Tanner, who depicted his people being set free with the Annunciation. And we celebrate John the Baptist, who takes us to the wilderness, and Mary, the Mother of God, who reminds us that we're to be impregnated with the Word of God and to say, "Let it be done to me according to your word."